Y'all crack me up, the front row, like I'm gonna bite. So make sure that your phones are set to stun. Be here now. Something to take some notes, whether that's electronic, and if it is electronic, I don't want you checking your text and your mail, or something to write with, because there'll also be a couple exercises I'm going to have you go through. We're actually going to start with this. I want you to tell the person next to you in 30 seconds or less what you did this past weekend. Ready, set, go. All right. Enough sharing. Back up front, please. Based on the energy in the room, I would say there were some good weekends. I actually did that because I want to humble brag about my weekend. On Saturday, I spent the day with the CEO, a chemistry professor, and a firefighter. And on Sunday, I spent the day with a member of Team USA. Somebody that's world champion, has an American record, really, really stellar career.
But did you watch Game of Thrones?
I did not. So, CEO, chemistry professor, and firefighter. Kelly, Terry, and Shannon, my college roommates. Member of Team USA is actually my daughter. Let me ask you this. When I said CEO, chemistry professor, firefighter, member of Team USA, did you imagine all women? Did you imagine a woman with a disability? This is how unconscious bias works. We're filtering information all the time, and it's having us make decisions without us really understanding why we've made those decisions. So that's what we're going to dig into today, how unconscious bias is impacting all of us all the time, and what we can do to hack this biased brain of ours and create an inclusive place where everybody can thrive. How many of you have a pancreas? Yep, little tip, if you didn't have one, you wouldn't be here. Our pancreas and our brain have something in common, and that is that they are both an organ. Now, let's say I were diabetic. I could do a ton of research and figure out why my pancreas wasn't secreting insulin properly. But I could not then turn around and say, all right, pancreas, do it right. It's the same thing with our brain and unconscious bias. It is a part of the way the organ functions, so simply knowing is not enough. We have to interrupt. Just as if I were diabetic, I would need insulin. With interrupting bias, we need bias interrupters, right? Otherwise, the unconscious bias keeps going, just like the CEO, firefighter, and chemistry professor example. So, if you take nothing else from our time together today, it's understand this. We have to interrupt the brain, the organ, in order to build inclusion. Do you know who these two folks are? Michael Phelps, he's about 6'6", and Simone Biles, she goes about 4'9", right? Big white dude, tiny African-American woman. They literally walk in the world with different perspective. Here's what I'd like you to do. And I won't do the really fun part of this, Dave, where I have people stand on their chairs just for safety. I feel like, yeah. When I ask you to, I want you to do one of two things. I either want you to sit on the floor, or I want you to stand up and turn and face somewhere completely different in the room. And then for about 15 seconds, I just want you to observe what you see and hear. So either sit on the floor, or stand up and turn and look in a completely direction. All right, come on back to your chairs. All right, one or two of you, what were a couple of things that you saw or observed?
Uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable. Were you on the floor? I was guessing. Ah, right, could only see and experience the people around you. One more. Sometimes it's like, oh my gosh, she's got great shoes on. We really need to clean this carpet. That was a tiny, tiny shift in perspective. Tiny. And you saw things that you would not see otherwise. Right? You saw that you could only see the people that were on the floor with you. Sometimes it's like, wow, I never knew that we had that piece of art. I have to tell you, when I see winning, I think Charlie Sheen. Yay, Tiger Blood, winning. It's great. You should never, ever forget that core value. That's what understanding unconscious bias is. It's really understanding that we walk in the world seeing things through our lens, through our perspective, and to understand that that's not the only perspective. I'm actually going to read a quote from a neuroscientist. And yes, I've hit the age where I need these. Even though we accept the reality that's presented to us, we're really only seeing a little window of what's happening. A lot of this happens unconsciously. We don't know how much we're interpreting. The world presents itself like it's reality, and we don't know how much we've already filtered that. There's a psychologist, Lee Brosnan, who calls this naive realism. We perceive the world as real, but we're doing a lot of spinning as the information comes in. That's David Eagleman. He's a neuroscientist at Baylor. There is fascinating, fascinating research that's coming out all the time around unconscious bias. And it really is this: our perspective is not the only perspective. We can only see what the mirror reflects for us. One of the biggest bias interrupters you can put in place is, what else could be true? This is what the mirror is reflecting back to me. What's another perspective? How can I sit on the floor here? How can I turn and face? How could I think about this from the perspective of one of our customers who's living in rural America with a disability? What might their perspective be? Who's not in this room that we need to consider and think about their perspective? And how do we go out and seek that perspective? So what else could be true? What's another reality versus the one that I'm seeing? First exercise, I want you to, and I'm going to go through these very quickly. You're going to have 5 seconds or less. Write down the very first characteristic that comes to mind. I will not ask you to share this. I will not ask you to share this with the person sitting next to you. If you want to chew up your notes and swallow them after we are done, you can do that. First characteristic, don't edit yourself. Are you ready? All right. An older person. A Muslim man. A mother of young children. A fundamentalist Christian. A person in a wheelchair. A female software engineer. You probably just took the first pop quiz where having no answer is having the right answer. You just got to peek in the box at your own unconscious bias. You couldn't come up with a characteristic of an entire group of people unless you'd first filtered that through bias. And that's actually how our biases have evolved, how this human brain has evolved to where it is. Our biases help us sort and filter information really quickly. If we didn't have unconscious bias, we would be curled up in a ball in the corner sucking our thumbs from information overload. I'm going to read this to you. A newspaper is better than a magazine. A seashore is a better place than the street. At first, it's better to run than to walk. You may have to try it several times. It takes some skill, but it's easy to learn. Even young children can enjoy it. Once successful, complications are minimal. Birds seldom get too close. Rain, however, soaks in very fast. Too many people doing the same thing can also cause problems. One needs lots of room. If there are no complications, it can be very peaceful. A rock will serve as an anchor. If things break loose from it, however, you will not get a second chance. Huh? Unless you know I'm talking about a kite. Then when you read this, it all makes sense. So again, this is what our brains and our unconscious bias allows us to do. Make sense of all this disparate information really, really quickly. The problem is, a lot of times our unconscious bias is wrong. And our biases, they're starting to figure out, are shaped from a very, very young age. And it's everything from media messages, parenting, education. Nobody is doing this on purpose. We all have unconscious bias. This is where things start to get a little funky. People are like, wow, you do unconscious bias training? How's that go? I'm like, well, I use humor and I use science. Let's talk about privilege. Has anybody in this room been told they have privilege? Did that feel kind of crappy? Yeah, right? It's like, ooh, like privilege, what does that mean? Well, what does it mean? It is not about individuals, right? It's about groups and how groups and the groups that you belong to are treated by society. So I have positive privilege because I'm white, I'm cis, I'm able-bodied, and I'm hetero. All of those things give me a positive bias. The fact that I am a woman, I have some headwinds, right? It doesn't mean that on my path or on your path that I haven't worked hard. It doesn't mean that there haven't been challenges. When we talk about unconscious bias and systems, it's about groups of people and how we benefit or are put at a disadvantage based on the groups that we're in and how society views those. I liken it to this. It's like having headwinds and tailwinds. So as in business, if you are white, male, hetero, able-bodied, you have a nice, gentle tailwind pushing you along. It's not huge, it's not a gale, right, but it's this belief that you're capable, that you can lead, that your ideas are good. For the rest of us, there's this slight headwind. And over time, if you think about what that comes to, it's a really big difference in how we experience the world. Either a nice tailwind pushing me along or having to tack back and forth to get to that same destination. This point is critical. We don't want to take those tailwinds away. How fantastic is it that we have groups of people that we believe are capable, that we believe are ready to lead, that we see potential in? Instead, what we're doing when we interrupt unconscious bias, it's creating a tailwind for everyone. It's unleashing everybody's potential. So think about the headwinds and tailwinds and everything that we're going to talk about today, about every single one of us, every single person on your team, being able to come in and share every one of their gifts. and unleash unlimited potential in every single person. Wow, that's a pretty extraordinary place to work. Sometimes people are like, oh, Mo, this is just babies and puppies and kittens and warm and fuzzy stuff. Not really. Lots of research around the benefits of being on diverse and inclusive teams. They're smarter, more likely to have ideas developed, prototyped, innovation is implemented more likely to capture new market share, increase patent citations, efficiency. I'm not even getting into the financial drivers here. So both on the smart side of things and then on the unleashing the potential of everybody in terms of commitment, effort, lower turnover. In short, being on a diverse and inclusive team is being on a winning team. How many of you saw the picture of the black hole that just came out? How extraordinary was that? And I generally don't really care about stuff like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a picture of a black hole. This is what it took to do that. Look at the picture of this team. You can see age, race, gender. One of the lead scientists is a part of Out in STEM. Right? The diversity of this team really reflects the diversity of the world. And look at what they were able to do. Take a picture of a black hole, something we never thought was possible. So as we're going through this today, I want you to think about the potential. And I'm going to ask you to do some things that are simple but not easy. And when I'm asking you to do those, and when it's 6 months from now, and you're faced with a decision on whether to step up and be an ally, or how to have a difficult conversation, I want you to think about the kids in your life. Whether that's your own kids, the neighbor kid, your nieces, your nephews, some kiddo that you care about. And keep them in mind because they're watching us. And we all have the opportunity right now, this moment in time, to create a more inclusive world. So let's get started. We know that knowing isn't enough. We're going to go through and talk about how to interrupt bias in both process and systems. And I'm actually going to go through this portion pretty quickly, and then everyday inclusion, and that's where we're going to spend some more time. Recruiting. I have a friend who was in a job that she liked but didn't love. And the recruiters were calling. She took the calls, had a couple of phone interviews, and went in for a panel interview. And she walked into the room, and she was introduced to 3 middle-aged white guys, all named Dave. And she said she knew in that moment, first, like, whoo, don't have to worry about forgetting anybody's name, but also that she wasn't going to take the job because they didn't make a joke about it, they didn't acknowledge it, they couldn't even see it. And they were giving her clues about what it was going to be like to work there as a woman. And she has a choice, so she chose not to go there. You're leaving breadcrumbs all over the place in your recruiting efforts. Whether that's who's on your panels, what your website looks like, what your marketing materials, who you're sending out to job fairs, every single one of those is telling a story. Your social media feeds. You need to look at that through the lens and say, if I'm any part of recruiting, right, if somebody's coming in and maybe I'm even just answering a couple of questions as they're walking around the building, what can I do to tell the story of diversity here? What can I do to tell the story of inclusion here? And there are some companies that aren't there yet, and they need to say, we're not there yet, but we want you to be a part of that journey because we're committed to this. So think about that, and I know you're spending a lot of time here right now, so, and also thinking about, there are so many studies that have been replicated again and again and again that talk about how job descriptions are written, and the language that we use in job descriptions that's turning people off or attracting people. Literally only changing a name from John Smith to Jamal Smith. Jamal's not getting called in for an interview. John is. Same thing with women, ethnic names. So anything you can do for blind screening, you really start to change your numbers overnight. Orchestras did that in the 1970s. They literally did blind screening. They, interviews with women, they talk about tiptoeing in so that their high heels wouldn't click. And orchestras, those that chose to do the blind screen auditions, their numbers changed. So again, remember, nobody is doing this on purpose. And whatever you can do to interrupt that bias really helps. There is, for those on the, do you call it your parents' network? There is research that tells us that if anything identifies me as a mom on a resume, I'm not going to get the interview. So really, which is crazy to me. It's crazy to me that we see having been in sports as a qualifier, but being a parent not. Wow, I've done both, parenting way harder. And then we know that talent pools, until you have 25% women in a talent pool, statistically 0% chance she's going to get hired. So when I talk about some things being simple but not easy, when you think about a position coming open on your team and you need a warm body right now to get that work done, and I'm telling you we got to wait until we have 25% in the talent pool, that's hard. That's hard, but you know that the results at the end of the day are worth it. So you may know these three women. Ursula Burns is the former CEO of Xerox. Indra Nooyi just stepped down as CEO of PepsiCo. And Sheryl Sandberg, who's been under a little bit of fire lately, COO of Facebook. All three of those women got to where they are because they were wicked smart. They've managed their careers well, right? They've worked incredibly hard, and they've also gotten there because of the three men next to them. Each one of them has talked about their sponsor and how critical their sponsor was to getting them where they are. If you're not familiar with the concept of sponsorship, a sponsor is a mentor on steroids. A mentor will say to you, oh, you know, when I was in your shoes, I did this. And they'll offer you advice. They'll tell you maybe you should or shouldn't do that. A sponsor is saying, get on my hip. I'm taking you to the top with me. I'm putting your name in the hat for pay raises, for promotions, for stretch assignments. It's an incredibly active relationship, and the research tells us it is the secret sauce to getting into leadership. We know this. Women and people from underrepresented groups have 4 times fewer sponsors than men. Why? Well, the first, in the case of women, is we think it's cheating. Gonna do it myself or die trying. So we need to teach women that it's not cheating, this is the way the game is played. Any young woman in your life, let them know the power of sponsorship. Anybody from an underrepresented group in your life, let them know the power of sponsorship. Not cheating, the way the game is played. The second is I want you to write down the names of the 3 people in this world that you are closest to. Cannot be your spouse or partner. If your kid got thrown in jail, you would tell them. If you have deep, dark secrets, they know them. Maybe you've gone on vacation together. They are your inner circle. I used to say 10, and people are like, who has time for 10? I'm like, good call, I don't. Right, so 3 people that you're closest to. Okay, next to their names, what is their gender identity? Level of education? Race? Are they married or single? Kids, no kids? You're probably seeing a pattern here. Does anybody have a group of people that are wildly different than they are? So is a couple people in the room. Go you. Most of us, the people that we are closest to in this world, look a lot like us. Like me bias is one of our strongest biases. Like me bias says, I'm going to give you trust. I'm going to believe you and believe in you because you're like me. And I know and like and trust myself, and I can extend that to you. So how does that show up in terms of sponsorship? If we have mostly white, straight, able-bodied men at the top, sponsorship looks like this. Gosh, you know, he reminds me a lot of me. I'm going to invite him to go golf with that client. Or I'm going to include him on this email string about this project. Or I'm going to get him exposure to the management team. And without realizing it and not doing it consciously, that develops into a sponsorship relationship. And if we know that sponsorship is the secret sauce to getting into leadership, we have to interrupt that pattern. It's easy to do when leaders understand the power of sponsorship and that they need to sponsor somebody who doesn't remind them of them, who's very different than them, and to get conscious about that. And as a leadership team, talking about how are we choosing who we're sponsoring and who we're mentoring, and not leaving that to chance, but being really thoughtful about it. And each one of us, as we're thinking about who we're mentoring and who we're sponsoring, because at different points in our careers, we're all going to have the opportunity to be a sponsor. Sponsor somebody who's not like you. The third one is we got to talk about sex. And Dave's like, oh crap, where is she going with this? We have to talk about the implication of sex. The research tells us this. Why don't older men want to sponsor younger women? They don't want people thinking they're having an affair. And why don't younger women want to be sponsored by older men? They don't want people thinking they slept their way to the top. And that makes perfect sense, particularly right now when there is so much skittishness around Me Too and Time's Up. So when I say we have to talk about sex, we actually have to talk about sponsorship and the importance of having people not like each other. This one is particular around gender, that we need older men to be sponsoring younger women because it's the secret sauce. And that those relationships are not about sex, they're actually about sponsorship. There are organizations now, with the climate being the way it is, that are saying, you know what, we're going to designate some conference rooms. We're actually going to have different places where people can go out to dinner, that people know that that's a safe zone, that if they're seen out together or if they're seen in those situations, that we know that's about sponsorship. And everybody can stop with the middle school assuming that it's about sex. It's amazing how quickly this works. There's a parking company that we work with, $1 billion parking company. I'm a girl from the Midwest. I did not know that parking was such a big deal until $1 billion parking company. And we went and we spoke to 150 of their regional managers. And they knew, because they've been growing so quickly, that they consider talent like Cookie Monster, like they just are gobbling up talent. And if they wanted to continue to grow at the rate they wanted to grow, they were going to need more women in leadership. And when I introduced this concept to this 150, there was one woman in the room, the rest of them were guys. There was like this audible sigh. They're like, it's going to be okay. Now we know that we can sponsor women. And they did. Within a year, those numbers started changing. So teach people that it's not cheating. Sponsor and mentor somebody who's not like you. And make sure that there's an organizational conversation happening about the need for sponsorship between older and younger, and that that's not about sex, it's about sponsorship. Promotions. Does anybody know who this is?
Yeah, isn't it the director of Zero Dark 30, Catherine Bigelow?
Boom, very close. It is the director of Wonder Woman, Patty Jenkins. So when Patty Jenkins got the role of, was named director of Wonder Woman, she was not actually their first choice. She had been going after Warner Brothers for over 10 years because she had this idea. And they didn't pick her first. The project was actually in trouble, in real trouble. So she was brought in to be director, and the press was saying things like this, right? She's obviously this big gamble for Warner Brothers. She had already had all of these accolades. At the time that Wonder Woman came out, she made Warner Brothers a boatload of money. It was the highest grossing superhero origin story at the time. Black Panther went on to overcome that. So, wow, but she was seen as this incredible risk. Perfect analogy for what we do for women in underrepresented groups when it comes to promotions. We already have to be performing at. We have to be Wonder Woman. And white guys need to be capable of. So how do you take care of that? How do you interrupt that? You have very clear criteria for promotion. You don't leave it up to gut feel. You don't leave it up to I think they're ready. You don't leave it up to like me bias. It's these are the behaviors, these are the capabilities, and these are the experiences. And we can check the boxes, right? And be able to see that this is, that they're ready or not. Here is something that is interesting about promotions as well. When we think about traditional leadership behaviors, and we think about some of the cultural norms, both around whether it's people that are raised in from Asian cultures or women, we're really terrible at taking credit for our work. You'll hear people, either women or people from Asian cultures, saying things like, oh, you know, when you say, gosh, great job on that project, oh, it was nothing. It was the team. Oh, I've been really lucky. I had a woman run up to me once after. She's like, my God, I've used all 3 of those in one sentence. Those are big red flags when you hear those things being said. Because we have these cultural norms that make it hard to accept credit, if you see that, that's a red flag to say, okay, I need to ask that person more. I need to ask them, okay, you did have a great team, but tell me your contribution. And allow them the chance to talk about what they've really done. Dig a little deeper. Don't take this at face value because it's not true. It's the cultural norm. And then we've got imposter syndrome, right? Really believing that we're not qualified, so not putting our name in the hat. So you actually, for promotions, might have to reach down and say, you might not think you're ready, but I do. I want to see your name in that hat. I'm not saying you're going to get the promotion. I am saying I want to see you go for it. Because if you don't get it, you're going to learn what you need to do to be prepared for the next one. And if you do, look at that. You just got promoted. That's active leadership. Instead of thinking about who actually are the first people in your headlights, right? The first people in the headlights, we actually have something that we call the rule of 2. Kaiser Permanente started it. That when you're looking at promotions, and you can actually look at this as stretch assignments as well, only 2 people in the candidate pool can look the same. After that, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th candidates all have to look differently. I will tell you from a low-hanging fruit perspective, every single organization that we've worked with said the rule of 2 is magic because it does cause us to go back and look again, and there's talent that's ready. They just weren't the first people that we thought about. Retention. Men still can't have babies. I don't know that you would if you could. And maternal bias is really real. There's a ton of research that says we don't believe that women can be both good moms and good employees. We tend to pull off the gas pedal for new mothers, like, oh, you know what, I'm not gonna ask her to go to that conference. I'm not going to ask her to take on that new project because I don't want to overburden her. But we're not doing that to new dads. So when we think about maternal bias, when we think about family events, because by the way, I don't know a single parent that wants to miss their kid's soccer game. I don't know a single parent that doesn't want to be involved in their kids' lives. So there's bias against dads who really want to be involved too, is really looking at hiring for retention and saying that life events are going to happen, and when those life events happen, we have to treat them like fingerprints. There is a consulting firm, a services firm on the West Coast. Actually, they just acquired one of the largest CPA firms here in Denver, and they have had, they've been expanding like crazy. And they knew when they looked at who was coming out of school with finance and accounting degrees and who's getting their CPAs, it was mostly women. And then they looked at who was in their partner ranks, and they said, uh-oh, something's got to change if we want to keep growing. And so they started this hire for retention policy, and that says if you are already a high performer and you have a life event, and this is available to men, to women, to everybody in the organization if they're a high performer, that for a period of time, it's typically a year, it's got to be good for you and it's got to be good for the company, we'll have a flexible work arrangement. And they now, the only time they drop in numbers is when they acquire another firm, but they are the top employer for female and diverse partners. So we've got an aging workforce, and we're going to have more and more employees who, whether it's parenting or taking care of a sick and aging relative, it's way easier to keep those people through that life event than it is to find somebody, train them, get them up to speed. So hire for retention really makes sense. It means thinking about things differently. Thinking about if you actually care about a butt in a seat or if you care about desired results. And knowing that if we're giving somebody a flexible work arrangement, that does not take them off the leadership track. Because these things are going to happen. We just can't continue to be surprised by them. So, woo! How's that for fast through recruit, develop, promote, and retain? I'm sweating up here. You all look comfortable. Actually, we're not going to have time for questions right now. What I want you to do is write down one aha, one thing that you think that you can do around process and systems. It might be for yourself, like, wow, I just realized I've got to get myself a sponsor. Or it could be you're in a leadership position, any part of this. What's something that you can do to interrupt bias when it comes to the talent cycle process and systems? All right, let's talk about inclusive teams and inclusive everyday behaviors, how you show up. Because by the way, everything that we're talking about is not programmatic. It's about how we show up every day. You know, there's that saying, there's no I in team. All right, but inclusion starts with I. This is really, when we talk about inclusion, it's about how you and I treat each other every day. That's not driven by something Dave does or Eric does. That's driven by you and I, sitting next to each other day in and day out. Are you making me feel like I belong here? Am I making you feel like you belong here? So inclusion is every single person's responsibility. And it's how you show up day in and day out. And it's the choices that we make every day. So I'm going to give you some tools to think about how to be inclusive day in and day out. So talking about teams. Western culture, squeaky wheel gets the grease. Eastern culture, loudest duck gets shot. There's research that tells us that women are interrupted more and speak less in meetings. Introverts and extroverts. My husband, when he says something, he's thought about it. I'll just blurt out stuff until I come up with a good idea. So when we think about a typical meeting structure, It's actually designed for a very small subset of people to succeed. And we know that in meetings, that's where our ideas are shown, where we get credit for things. So inclusive teams actually have a no interruptions policy. And not only a no interruptions policy, but an everybody speaks policy. And you build in some quiet time for those introverts. You make sure that every person, their voice is heard, because that's where you're going to tap the potential of everybody sitting around that table, not just the loudmouths like me. Because I'm okay if somebody interrupts me, because I'm going to keep talking right over them. That's not typical. So we actually have a whole tool around this in our micro-learning that is all of the things that you can do in teams, whether it's decision-making, in this case, meetings. This is really low-hanging fruit. Really low-hanging fruit. You can start this tomorrow in your team meetings. You could start it this afternoon in your team meeting. Hey guys, heard the speaker. She was jumping around up front talking about interrupting unconscious bias. And I know that if we want to get all the best ideas out, we have to have no interruptions and everybody speaks. Are you guys game to do that? Most teams will be. So who's going to take the notes? And everybody looks at the woman, right? And we're expected to be helpful. When you're note-taking, it's really hard to participate fully. It's really hard to participate fully. And if you're a woman, and if you are a woman who likes to please, you're going to offer to take those notes in the deafening silence when nobody else is speaking up. What do inclusive teams do? They just rotate it. They don't leave it up to chance. This week it's you, next week it's you, next week it's you, next week it's you, and they keep track. So who's going to take the notes? I don't know. Whose turn is it? Right? Very simple. So remember I talked about the subtle headwinds and the subtle tailwinds? We're not talking about one of these things impacting. We're talking about all of these things. Death by a million paper cuts. That's what unconscious bias can feel like. So little things like, hey, we're not going to allow for interruptions, and we're going to rotate the note-taking. And we're going to have this thing that's called office housework that we also delegate. Office housework is, hey, can somebody, it's going to be Janet's birthday next week. Can somebody go pick up the card and order lunches? And you know what, we decided that we're going to do a March Madness pool. Can somebody print out all those sheets? And who's going to get the coffee for the meeting? And. This chips away because, again, there are the people with less power on your teams are going to be expected to do this. Well, not a big deal, except when it starts to add up. If I'm spending a half an hour a week, 2 hours a month on office housework, that's 2 hours that I've just spent on something that is not showing up on my review, that is not showing up in terms of and by the way, a half an hour a week is actually a pretty low estimate. So when you think about all of those little tasks, those also, whose turn is it? Whose turn is it to get the birthday card? Whose turn is it to get the coffee? Whose turn is it to make sure that the AV is all set up? Any number of things. And when you start to pay attention, there's a lot of office housework that happens. Just simply delegate it, rotate it. Don't have people having to think about raising their hand or having to speak up and say, you know what, I'm spending a lot of time on this. Think about your social and cultural events as a team. What are you doing for fun? I have a friend that is a double amputee and a Mormon. She's like, yeah, the beach, not really my place, right? But my team likes to take our retreats at the beach. Lots of drinking and places where it's very difficult for me to walk with my prosthetics. So it's subtle things, right? Asking, how are we rewarding? What are the things that we're doing for fun? Are we always going to the baseball game and golfing? There are a small set of people that is dynamite. And there are a whole bunch of people, not so much. And they're actually going to opt out. There's a woman, I love this, her team, she was the only woman on a software development team. And the guys on her team really loved doing whiskey tasting after work. So that's what they did for fun. And she doesn't drink. And she finally said, hey guys, can we add cupcakes? Can we do whiskey and cupcake tasting? Because then I'll show up. And everyone's like, who doesn't love cupcakes? And so now she can participate. But thinking about what you're doing, how you're having fun together, what you're rewarding. We have a whole thing around inclusive meetings, and I just want to bring this one up really quickly because I see it happen again and again, and it's not as much social and cultural, it's more around the meeting side, but it can be on this. How many times have you gotten to a meeting and somebody's like, oh, it's fine, I don't need the mic. And the person with the hearing impairment doesn't want to speak up and say, I actually need you to use the mic. Because that's putting the person that is underrepresented having to advocate for themselves instead of always use the mic. The segment of the US population with the greatest hearing loss actually might surprise you. It's millennials. They were coming of age when earbuds were coming in and before volume control was in place. So always use the mic. And if you have the opportunity, always be the person to make sure that a mic is available. Social and cultural, every baby, every marriage, every union gets celebrated the same way. It doesn't matter if you've got a same-sex couple, if it's an adoption, whatever it might be, make sure whatever your norms are, they're the same across the board. And what an awesome opportunity. Anytime you can celebrate as a team, do that. Actually, I'm going to keep us going. At the individual level, when there's a glitch in software, like we have in our brains, you put in place an API. So I'm going to talk about the API for our own individual bias brains. If you have the opportunity, Harvard University has the implicit association test. It's harvard.implicit.edu, and I can send that link afterward to Lee or somebody so you can have that. You can go out and whether it's around gender, race, age, disability, they've got a set of assessments that you can take to figure out your own unconscious bias. Over 13 million people have taken that now, myself included. I took the one around gender. And guess what? I have an unconscious bias for men at work and women at home. This is the work I do, and I still have that unconscious bias. So I want to keep reminding you, nobody is doing this on purpose. We all have it. We all have to hack our bias brains. This is a journey. You're never going to be there. You're never going to be 100% woke. Things continue to change. I will tell you, gender pronouns was not a thing we were talking about 5 years ago. And now you'll see people's signatures, right, what their pronouns are. We're all learning all the time. So thinking about, as an individual, hacking your bias brain and your API. A stands for ask. Asking, what else could be true? Great quote by Einstein, I'm not a genius, I'm just curious. I ask a lot of questions. He actually happened to be a genius too, but he was really curious. Curiosity is one of our greatest gifts when it comes to inclusion. If I can stay curious and learning and trying to be better and trying to figure out how to be more inclusive, that is a great gift to the people around me. And if you and I, right, if inclusion comes to how you and I are treating each other, and I stay curious about you and what matters to you and how you tick and how I can make you feel like you belong, wow. And if you're giving that back to me, so ask those questions. What else could be true? What's the bias here? Not is there a bias here, but what's the bias here at play? And who's not in the room that we should be considering? What are some of the really cool cultural norms of the people on my team? How do they celebrate? What kind of food do they eat? Right? What are their, what are their traditions? And just staying curious, like childlike mind when it comes to this. Now, don't expect the people on your team to continually be educating you. Right? If you're asking them to continually educate you, that gets exhausting. So instead of that, it's staying curious and doing a little research yourself. Wow, I just found this out about Ramadan. That's fascinating. I didn't know that before. Prime is your P. There is incredibly fascinating research that tells us this. If we simply look at pictures of people from underrepresented groups who are well known and successful, it temporarily reduces our bias. They're trying to figure out actually if there's a way to, instead of temporarily, make that permanent. So if you're about to have that customer conversation with somebody that you know is a person of color or has a disability or is LGBTQ, whatever it might be, prime yourself. Right? Look at some photos. One of the primary researchers on the implicit association test, she's actually Pakistani by birth. And when she took her own assessment that they'd put together around race and ethnicity, she found that she had an unconscious bias toward white people versus people of color. She's like, wow. And by the way, my results and her results are really typical. I can be from an underrepresented group, and the research tells us that I still think more favorably of people in my group than if I'm not in the group, but I still have a more favorable opinion of people from the dominant group. So when I say this is not one group doing this, right, this is how our brain sorts and filters. So when she understood her own unconscious bias around race, she also read the research around priming. And so her screensaver is actually scrolling photos like this. So she's daily reminded and priming herself about people from underrepresented groups who are incredibly successful. The other thing to do is remind the people on your team. When you're having a conversation, when you're deciding what to do on a project, when you're thinking about who to bring on the team, or whatever it might be, reminding people about unconscious bias. Hey, let's think about what might be at play here. Could it be maternal bias? Maybe we're facing maybe this could be more about ageism than it is about this person's capability. And I is investigate. Look around the room, whether that's a virtual room or literally the room that you're in, and say, who is not represented here? Whose perspective could we benefit from? Who's sitting on the floor that we don't have in the room? Think about your customer base. When you think about your customer base, it's literally anyone you could imagine. Diversity across the spectrum. So when you're making decisions, make sure those decisions you're considering the diversity and thinking about who's not there and asking them, how do we get their perspective in the room? How do we get those people to join us? And if we can't literally get them to, then say, okay, if I were in those shoes, what might it be like? If I used a wheelchair, what would this meeting be like? Or how would this decision impact me? So ask, prime, and investigate. This is where I'm about to ask you to really roll up your sleeves, which seems about good timing because the energy in the room just went like this. And by the way, I should have said this at the start. I'm terrible at sitting. So if you need to stand up, whatever you need to do to learn and stay engaged, go ahead and do that. Okay, AAA. AAA is about how you show up day in and day out. And AAA stands for Ally, Amplify, and Advocate. So I talked about privilege earlier. We all have privilege at different times. You can think about those situations where you knew that you were in the dominant group. And there are times for every single one of us when we can be an ally. I've given you a tool around AAA. Allyship is this. It's me spending my privilege. And spending my privilege is really fun. And sometimes it's really scary and it takes some courage. And being an ally is way more a verb than it is a noun. It's the things that I do. Let me give you an example. There was a leadership team that they had a woman on their team who had been taking more and more on her plate. Her role was expanding. And she was actually going out on medical leave. So the team was meeting to say, okay, she's going to be out for 6 months. What are we going to do? Like, who's taking what? And there was a guy on the team, Dan, who looked and started pulling chunks of her work and said, I'll take this, and I'll take this, and I'll take this. And because I'm taking on all these additional responsibilities, can we talk about my compensation? And the team said, of course we'll talk about your compensation, and yes, it makes sense that you should make more. And then Dan had a light bulb moment. And he said, you know what? We didn't compensate Linda more. And the whole team went, we didn't, did we? And there was another woman on the team who was like, yeah, guess what? And they all started a conversation. They hadn't realized that they were doing it. And the women were simply just taking on more work and not advocating for themselves, not asking for more compensation. Just, okay, I'll do more, I'll do more, I'll do more. And when the guy had that happen to him and he asked for compensation, he was an ally. He was an ally for the women on the team saying, hey, we have to look at this, not just for me, but how are we approaching this all the time? And that's a really key part of allyship too. Sometimes it's speaking up just in the moment, but real allies, you're trying to change the system. And saying, is there a pattern here where we can change the pattern where the next person benefits and the next person benefits? Sometimes it's letting people know that you see them and you see their experience and you believe it and you're there for them if they need you. Right? So it could be I see what's going on, let me know if you need me to step in. But I got your back. Allyship is very much about teammates having each other's back and saying, I know your experience, I get to spend my privilege when I can, I'm here to support, let me know if you need that, but not trying to come in and be a savior. Because then if you're gonna run off and say, guess what I did? I helped so-and-so and I did all these cool things. That's when you know that might be more about savior than allyship. So if you think about the times in your life and when you talk to people, each one of us who have experienced somebody being an ally, it feels pretty incredible. And it feels good to do it, and like I said, sometimes you might have to, your voice might shake, but still be the ally. Because if you're not, imagine the experience of the person who is being, whether that be undermined or whatever's happening to them, and feeling alone. Advocacy, I'll start with amplification actually. Amplification is a part of allyship. And that is making sure somebody's voice is heard and amplified. Right? It's giving them a microphone. At Moxie, we are developing an everyday inclusion app. It's incredibly exciting and a lot of work. And I was meeting with the UX team. And there's a woman on that team who is very soft-spoken, and she's Filipino-American. And it's interesting, as we were talking about how we were going to roll the app out, and what that looked like, and what markets we were going to go to, she's brought up an idea about having beta companies. And she said it very quietly, and she was mid-thought, and another person on the team, another woman on the team, jumped in and ran with it and was like excited, like, oh my gosh, blah, 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 blah. In that moment, I simply said this: hey, Viviana, you started us down this path on beta companies. Can you say more? And I brought it back to her because we are going to use beta companies, and it's really important for everybody in the room to understand that that was her idea. And she wasn't done speaking yet. She had more to share, and she actually did. She had like 3 more great points about what beta is going to look like. But had I let that go on, that would have gone, that credit would have gone to somebody else. Right? Her idea would have only been left kind of, it hadn't even germinated yet. And instead, she got to fully like flesh it out, and it's incredible. So amplification, it can be as simple as that. Hey, I realize you're not done speaking yet. Tell us more. Or, hey, I don't think you realize that you just interrupted Viviana. Can you let her finish? Because again, people aren't doing this on purpose. I'm terrible at interrupting people. It is something that I work on all the time. Because now I know the importance and what that does to other people. I'm really, really intentional about working on that and not doing it. And I ask my team to call me out if I am. So make sure you're amplifying those quiet voices. Make sure another way you can amplify is to create breaks where you, after, there's been this wild back and forth, everybody's speaking, just pause. And then ask the people in the room who've been a little more quiet what they're thinking. And then advocate. Advocacy looks like this. I was early in my career, and there was an industry conference, and the guy that I reported to came to me and said, hey, Mo, guess what? I recommended to the team that you speak at the conference. And I went, I'm not ready. He said, you are ready? And I told the team that you're ready, and this is going to be a stretch for you. Go do this. And it was enormous in terms of what that did for the credibility that I had with the management team, what it did for my career. He advocated, believed in me, put my name out there, right, and offered me this opportunity. And we all, if we think about AAA and being an ally and amplifying and advocating, this is where it gets fun. It's really cool to be able to do this for other people. What I want you to do in small groups is think about where are some opportunities for you to be AAA? Or what are some experiences that you've had where somebody has been, excuse me, an ally, or has amplified your voice, or has advocated for you, or you've seen them do that for other people. What does that look like at DISH? And what would that look like for you individually and for your team? Ready, set, go. come back up front. People are just like, what? What's happening? Jot yourself a quick note. What's one thing that you can do between now and Friday to be an ally? There's somebody in your life right now, whether it's here at work or outside, that you can be an ally for. So one thing you can do. Here's the messy reality. Somebody is going to say or do something incredibly stupid. Right? Something that makes somebody feel terrible, or makes somebody feel uncomfortable, or is so tone deaf you can't believe that just came out of their mouth. Right? It really, like, that is the reality of this. This is not clean, easy. We're all doing the best we can, and there's so much we don't know. So give me, just shout out a couple of biased interactions that you've either experienced or witnessed.
I just recently, when they sent out the note about bring your kids to work day, someone who sits near me said, "Are we allowed to call them boys or girls, or do we have to only say they since we can't see their gender?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Breathe."
Right? Breathe. So good first start, and we're going to talk about what you do.
Somebody who's not a native English speaker, so they immediately start talking louder, assuming that it helps them understand.
Yeah, my husband's from the South, has a really thick Southern accent. It's interesting watching people assume his IQ is low, and then him run circles around them. That's pretty fun. What are some others? Sweetie. Pumpkin.
I saw a young man get sexually harassed,
Yep.
and a young woman next to it said, "Oh, consider it a compliment."
Yeah, great. Yep. So we see these things all the time, don't we? You know, whether it's asking somebody to get the coffee. I've got a good friend who, she happens to be a PhD in biology, and we were at a conference, hotel, breakfast, and another one of the guests came up and said, "Yeah, we're out of coffee." Right? She's got brown skin. Assumption that she was a part of the staff. When you start to pay attention, my daughter is a little person. Wow, holy cow, the things you see with that. So what do we do? What do we do when these things happen? And first, why don't we speak up? Uncomfortable.
We don't want to draw attention to ourselves.
Don't want to draw attention to ourselves. Afraid, right? We don't want to say or do the wrong thing. Retaliation. Like, there are so many reasons. And this is that piece where I said sometimes this is going to take some courage. And sometimes it's going to take some vulnerability. All of that is way easier if what we've done is created safety. So we often don't speak up, and we're afraid of all of those things, every single thing that we talked about, because we have not created an environment of safety. And it's every one of our responsibilities to do this. It's particularly leadership's responsibility to create safety. But when you think about on your teams, with your peers, how you create safety is really important. And that is this, being willing to say, I don't know, but I'm going to keep trying. And I might not use the right words, and if I don't, will you please let me know? And I might do something that is off base. I can't fix that if I don't know. And as a team, we are going to commit to being inclusive. And that means that when the tough situations come up, we're going to talk about it. We're not going to sweep it under the rug. We don't get to inclusion because we're walking on eggshells. We don't get to inclusion because we start treating each other in very polite ways. instead of like, you know what, you and I have to have a messy conversation. But if you and I are committed that on the back end of that, we're coming out better, we can get through that. I often have people say, what do I do? Like, I thought about something great to say after the fact. Like I couldn't believe it. I was so stunned in the moment that had actually happened or been said. It doesn't have to happen right then. The important thing is that you actually have the conversation down the road. So letting it go or sweeping things under the rug does not let inclusion and does not let people thrive. So creating safety as a team. So think about, can you have the conversation with your team? To say, you know what, if we are willing to go there, the benefit to us all is really incredible. And if you think about, if you've ever really been on an inclusive team, what that feels like, it's pretty extraordinary. So to get through the messiness, you create safety. So I've given you some tips and tools here. One of the things in creating safety really is a level of humility and curiosity and courage and vulnerability, and assuming ignorance, not malice. Now, right now, if you think about how things feel in the United States, we're pointing a lot of fingers. It's a pretty dangerous time in that regard. When it comes to the people that you work with, I want you to assume ignorance, not malice, and to be willing to go there and to have the tough conversations. There's a framework for doing that. And the first is that you do create safety. Right? You have the, hey, we're all learning. And then you engage someone's goodness. It is the rare individual, except the sociopath, who shows up on a daily basis and says, I really want to make people feel terrible. I want to make people feel uncomfortable. I want to be just a rotten human being today. Most people are showing up doing the best they can. And so if you engage somebody's goodness and say, I know that you would never intentionally do this. Are you open to hearing about how you made so-and-so feel really uncomfortable or like they didn't belong? You're gonna be like, oh my gosh, I did? Like that's usually the response to that. And then you share what happened. Not dramatic, not embellishing, right? Just the facts. This, and this. And I've given you an example here about stealing credit for an idea. And then what the impact was. How you saw somebody shut down, or how you shut down, or what that did to the momentum, or how you've seen that person showing up as less than they could be because of the way they were treated, or what the incident was. And then solutions. Are you willing to do X, Y, and Z? Are you willing to learn X, Y, and Z? What ideas do you have? The cool thing about using this framework is that you can prepare these. Right? You can go in and have really, now you're only writing half the script. You don't know how the other person's gonna react. But at least you're ready with your data points. Instead of me coming to you and saying, you are such a jerk. Do you know what you just did? You're so wrong. That's getting us nowhere. Right? Versus, wow, are you willing? Are you open? And I will share mistakes that I've made. Right? In that creating safety. I'll share an example of language that I used with my own daughter. Where she's like, Mom, seriously? And I'm like, oh, wow. Right? Every one of us is on this learning journey. Are you willing to go there with me? And sometimes you have to talk about this as a team. Sometimes there's some really good ones to have if-then statements for. The things that you see pop up again and again. If this happens, then we're going to do this as a team. There's a simple one that's just simply, if somebody tells an off-color joke, if somebody asks somebody to go get the coffee, if you just simply say, we don't do that here. It's really powerful. We don't do that here. You've prepared for that. So what I want you to do is we've got about 5 minutes for this exercise. I've got some scenarios here. I want you in groups of about 8. And I want you to think about how you might use the conversation framework to work through these scenarios. These are great examples of things that could happen. Right? We've got an example of a transgender employee who's transitioning, a woman of color who keeps getting comments about her hair and her hair touched, and somebody with a disability and the people on their team not knowing language to use. You don't know which one you're getting, so actually, if you would just grab those and sort of pass them back and do the same. Get in groups. I'm going to give you 5 minutes, not much time. Start thinking about how you would use the conversation framework to work through the scenario. I do.
Maureen?
I do. And actually, there are colored ones here.
Oh, cool. Yes, thank you so much.
You're like,
yeah, there's a few.
you're like the handouts. What are you talking about?
I love
Are there
that.
more back there?
They were all on the chairs, and a nice young girl sat next. Nice young lady. Sorry, see,
That-
I'm getting better.
Right, but you caught it.
Yeah.
I say guys. Hey, you guys. 'Cause
I
I'm from
know,
the
'cause we-
Midwest, so now I'm trying
we
to say
grew up.
folks. Right.
Yeah.
But it's noticing. That's huge.
Hey, let me ask you a question. Do you have an email address? I have a great story I'd love to send to you.
Perfect.
About a woman, a trend-setting woman, young lady, who was on the Apollo 11 mission.
Oh, it'd be great.
And it's still in the movie theaters. If you get a chance, it's in the first 10 minutes. And here's a room full of 100 guys in 1969, and there's one
One
lady
yeah,
in
yeah.
it, and she's world famous now. She went on to teach, and she
Send it to me.
finished her career at NASA, and she was the only one in this vast. See, I sent it to a nice young lady who worked here, and she worked in software, and she was the only person almost on the whole second
Yeah, yeah.
floor.
Which is how it is.
Yes, yes.
Send it
so-
to me. So Maureen, Maureen,
Yes.
at Moxie, MOXIE,
Yes.
exchange.com.
Okay.
So
great.
if you look-
so it's just that.
Yep.
MoxieExchange.com.
Right, but Maureen
at.
Yeah,
Okay,
that'd be great.
It's a great story for you for later.
Yes.
Thank
There
you
are
so
so
much.
many.
Maybe have that dialogue with that individual privately, right? So instead of doing a group meeting, like, what do you want to be called? You know, like, have that comfort with that person, and then maybe.
Yep. This is the last thing. Okay. I hate to cut this off. It works, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, if you ever want to get the attention of a crowd, just blow in the mic. You got to start, but not finish, creating one of these conversations. So you can see how using the framework, and I didn't give you easy scenarios because these aren't easy and clean in the real world either. So the preparation and having the framework and having the conversation as a team is really critical. We talked about AAA, we talked about creating safety, we talked about the conversation framework. We actually have covered a lot of ground today. Like, woo, right? Knowing isn't enough. Stay curious. Think about, from a process standpoint, if you're engaged at all around the talent cycle, think about what you can do as a team. Think about how you can show up individually day in and day out. Inclusion starts with I. Think about what you're going to do. Because the greatest bias interrupter is every single one of you. The greatest builder of inclusion is every single one of you. And if you think about the ripple effects that can happen from those of you that are participating today, and taking these tools and having this commitment to building inclusion at DISH, imagine what can happen. It's pretty extraordinary. You were given a note card when you came in. I want you to write down one action that you're going to take, one thing that you're going to do, one idea that you're going to implement. And I want you to write your email address on that, and I want you to exchange that with the person next to you. And in a week, I want you to reach out to each other and say, how you doing? What progress have you made? Did you do that one thing that Mo asked you to commit to? Because this starts with the first baby step. You are the driver of inclusion. When my daughter was 9 months old, she'd already taught us that she was fiery and feisty and had strong opinions and was going to give us quite the ride as parents. I took her for her well baby visit. And we were about to leave, and I said to the doctor, hey, I want you to look at this one thing. And I took, a part of her form of dwarfism is having really flexible joints. So I took her little knee and I twisted it, and the doctor looked at me and said, oh, your baby's a dwarf. And in that moment, our life changed. And my husband and I, for about 2 weeks, could do nothing but cry. And I could see people's mouths moving, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. And our grief and our sorrow was so deep about how hard her life was going to be and how difficult and how limited. And then we both woke up 2 weeks later and looked at each other and said, same baby. What we had been doing for those 2 weeks was filtering her life through our unconscious bias about what it meant to have a disability, about what it meant to be a little person. The 9 months that we had had before that told us something different. I don't know if we had not had those 9 months, if she would have represented Team USA on 5 continents, world champion, blah, 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 4-time letter winner at UCSD. I don't know if the LA Games would have used her in their promo campaign to actually get the games back to the city. I don't know if she would have graduated from UC San Diego with a degree in marine biology and actually be doing shark research at the Bimini Research Lab as a mom. That's not a picture you ever want to get. But I do know we would have made it harder. We would have made it harder for her. We would have given her that headwind. without those 9 months. So when I'm asking you to interrupt bias and build inclusion, it's like giving that 9 months to everybody on your team and only seeing their potential and being committed to inclusion and understanding that inclusion starts with I and it's totally possible. You took the first step showing up here, being a part of the ERGs. I know that Lee's going to tell you more about that, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to work with all of you today and to be so engaged. Take that first step. Thanks.